So really warm welcome to all of you this evening. Delighted to see so many faces for this very special workshop on the topic of neurodiversity in coaching. So this workshop is hosted by the UK ICF Bath and Bristol chapter. It's an open group, which means it's open to all coaches and coach curious individuals. We are open whether you're an ICF member or not, whether you've trained and qualified or not, and we're here really to help build connection, community, and to provide opportunities for continued professional development. So this workshop carries 1.5 CCEUs for those of you who are members of the ICF. And those count towards your renewal or your reaccreditation. And if you're with another body, most likely they will also accept them and honour them. And for those of you that are coming along from any other background, they'll probably count as a continued professional development credit and be translated over for you should you wish to use them in some way. We have an hour and a half together this evening, so we'll be finishing at 5:30 p.m. UK time. I am the group lead for the UK ICF Bath and Bristol group. I'm also an associate board member for the ICF, and I've been running this group in the Bath and Bristol area now for about a year. And we have a monthly meetup on the same day of each month. So the second Monday of each month at from 4 till 5:30 p.m. We have a different topic each time we meet. We meet remotely for 3 sessions out of every 4, and then we meet in person on every 4th session, and we alternate the meetups between Bath and Bristol so that hopefully people can come and depending where they are in the region, come to one of those or both of those, as many members do. So please do spread the word about our sessions. Our aim is to help upskill as many coaches as possible, and as I say, build more of a sense of community and connection. So it's lovely to have you here. I have been training now for coaching for about 18 years, and training coaches to be burnout coach qualified and qualified in other specialisms as part of a business called Balanceology. I'm also a supervisor and a coach mentor and an assessor. And Polly and John, who joined us this evening, are both similarly really highly experienced and credentialed, both also coach supervisors, coach trainers, coach mentors. So you're in really good hands this evening, and I'll hand over to them right away now so that they can introduce themselves and take you through what we're going to be covering this evening and how the session will run.
Thanks, Jane. John, shall I go ahead? Shall I go first?
Please do.
Hi, everybody. It's lovely to have you all here, and particularly because lots of you will be from Bristol and Bath, and I grew up in Bristol. So we're having a conversation, John, Jane and I, about whether Jane should have a Bristol accent, and realised it's me who used to have one, although 20 years in London, actually maybe 30 years in London has made it disappear. I'm a coach. I mostly do one-to-one coaching with leaders, but I also do some group coaching, some coach training. I lead on a few women's development programs, and I'm a coach supervisor. In the last, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, my son was diagnosed with ADHD. So I'm fairly typical of a late diagnosis adult, because as the mum, when he was having his diagnosis, I was saying, well, that's normal, isn't it? Isn't that normal? Isn't everybody like that? And the psychiatrist at the end said, Mum, they always call you Mum. I find that quite annoying. They said, Mum, maybe you might like to explore whether you may also be neurodivergent. So I did, and I was diagnosed with ADHD about 3 years ago, which then really piqued my interest in what neurodiversity is, and then what we can do when we're coaching people who are neurodivergent, whether they know they are or then they don't, like I didn't, and ways, areas that we can really make a difference with our coaching, and things that we definitely don't want to do as coaches. So it's become a specialist area for me, and an area that I love working in. So I still wouldn't consider myself an expert. I think there aren't that many people who can yet, because there still isn't enough known about coaching people who are neurodivergent, but we're happy to share today everything we do know, just in case that can help you. So John, over to you.
Thanks, Polly. I just realized that I'm incredibly nervous, and I've been sitting here wondering why. What's that about? I've been doing a bit of self-inquiry because I present all day long, every day, facilitate, been doing it for years, don't usually feel like this, and I think it's because of the topic. It's a topic that's incredibly personal for me as a multi neurodiverse person. And I've often not accepted invitations to speak about this topic because it is so personal, actually. So that's probably a little bit what that's going on for me. And it's good for me to name that out loud. Nice to meet you all. My name's John Fleming. I'm in the southwest coast of Ireland in County Cork, right on the Atlantic. And I'm a coach, have been for over 15 years. Started coaching internally in an organization. That's where I originally got trained to be a coach, and then went down a big rabbit hole, became a psychotherapist, and these days do more personal development coaching in a private capacity, one-on-one with individuals and with groups. And my story
What's
is
wrong?
different.
Well, why don't you have why?
Thanks, Jane. Um, my story is slightly different in the sense that I didn't find out because of one of my children. I don't have kids, but it was from hanging around young people. So I was working a lot with people with emergent diverse identities. I have a lot of experience of working with people who are um, transgender or have diverse gender identities. And there's a higher percentage typically of neurodiversity in that cohort. And from being around that cohort, I learned a lot about myself, which I just thought, inverted commas, was normal. You know, I thought these are my idiosyncrasies or it's just the way I am. And that was really what pushed me to seek assessment. So originally it was dyslexia. That was actually while I was in my early 20s. And then subsequently, autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. So some people say I have the full set. But that's not really what it was about for me. For me, it was really about learning and understanding myself. And Polly's going to talk to you a little bit about something called spiky profile later on. And I might come back in at that point and say a little bit more about that in relation to me. So it's really nice to be with you all. I'm excited for Polly and I to share with you and to just give you an idea of what we're going to do. We are going to do a little bit of contracting around the group agreement to keep everybody feeling safe. Um, we're going to invite you to share with each other in small breakouts what your current perspectives on neurodiversity are. So what are you arriving with? We're going to talk then about what neurodiversity is from our perspective, and then look at neurodiversity in coaching. So what not to do, adopting what we refer to as a neuroaffirmative stance, and then looking at coaching someone who is neurodiverse versus coaching neurodiversity and the difference in those two things. And then we're going to invite you to go back into breakout rooms again and to share your perspectives, what perspectives you have now after hearing our content. And then there's going to be substantial amount of time at the end for some Q&A um, if people have questions arising out of what we've discussed. One thing that Polly and I really want to stress is that we're not experts, and this is not a training. This is a glimpse through a window for 90 minutes at what is a complex area. So we want to manage expectations about what people might walk away with. If you walk away with some additional awareness, curiosity, wanting to read more, wanting to learn more, that would be great from our perspective. But we're not expecting people who are going to walk away from this going, great, I have everything I need in my toolkit now, tick box, done. This area doesn't work like that. So that kind of forms part of our group agreement, I guess. And we had some prompts here about what we might agree, because this is a temporary group and it's a short amount of time. In an ideal world, we might have a kind of a facilitated conversation about how we want to structure things, but for time purposes, that's probably not feasible. So we really want to invite curiosity. Some of what we might present might be different or challenging to your perspective frame of reference. And if it is, we'd really invite you to meet that with curiosity rather than judgment. And we really want to invite you to take personal responsibility. So for your needs and for your learning. So say if something isn't working for you, get involved, type in chat, put your hand up. What's said here stays here, so confidentiality. It's fine for you to share what you learnt from this workshop, but if Polly and I share personal things about our own lives or experiences of being neurodiverse or working with our clients who are neurodiverse, we really want you to respect that and to not share that beyond this group. And we're going to start on time, stay on time, stop on time. So that goes for the whole session as a whole, but also when we're in breakout rooms. So really asking you to organize your time and to be back in the main room in a way that has allowed everybody in the room to have some space and time. Does that work for everybody here? Is there anything missing, anything additional people feel like you need? Maybe you could type that in chat if there is, and if there isn't, then we can move on.
John, just to add as well, for anybody who's joined us in the last 5 minutes, it's being recorded as well. So that we would hope that anybody watching the recording as well will be respectful of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Polly. Okay, so let's get stuck in then. We are going to pop you in some breakout rooms. So I'm going to hand you over to Polly to explain what we were inviting you to do.
Yes, so just as you're arriving here today, we thought it would be good for you to go into breakout rooms just to have a chance to connect with people who are also here and to talk about why you're here. So what has appealed to you about today's talk and what neurodiversity means to you. Again, only share what feels comfortable for you. There's absolutely no pressure for you to share anything other than what you'd like to share in the groups today. How many minutes are we doing 10 minutes in there, John?
10 minutes, yeah.
Just a 10-minute discussion in groups of 3 or 4 about why you're here. And if you could possibly turn your cameras on for this, that would be great. Thank you.
So some of this has been brought up from the conversations that you had in your groups about what is neurodiversity. I have a funny story about this that's personal. I got a dyslexia diagnosis when I was 24 after having felt like I was dyslexic, but it never being picked up. And then a therapist said to me one day, "Have you got assessed?" And I thought, no. And he said, "Well, that might be a good place to start." And I was like, "Oh, I can do that. Wow." So this also, I think, demonstrates, the lack of understanding out there actually is a big thing. So in relation to the question that came in for somebody about whether you should broach it or not, well, in my book, yes, because somebody broaching it with me and suggesting that it might be a good idea if I personally felt I was really helpful then in motivating me to go and do it. But also it kind of opened a blind that had been shut. I didn't know I could just go get it done. That was not something at 24 I was necessarily aware of. And then when I got my dyslexia diagnosis, I just thought, well, I'm dyslexic. And one day, a supervisor I had when I was studying transactional analysis said, "Oh, you're neurodiverse." And this was maybe about 3 or 4 years later. And I was thinking, what's that? And he was like, "Oh, well, if you're dyslexic, you're neurodiverse." And I was like, what does that mean? Again, I want to just demonstrate people's level of understanding. I had no idea that I was now in a cohort of people being identified as being neurodiverse because I was dyslexic. So people arrive to these things from all different places. And I think it's really important to stay out of the right or wrong argument about what neurodiversity is. And I definitely cannot be the policeman of what is and is not neurodiversity. My book is, well, if somebody feels like they're neurodiverse and that's something they want to identify with, good for them, and I'll support that. I'm not going to get into the situation of trying to tell them they are or are not, or that they need to meet a certain threshold. Now, seeking a diagnosis is a different system. That's because, like Polly said, it's having such a negative impact on your life. You need a diagnosis, most likely to access supports of some sort or to get accommodations. But there's a huge volume of people in the world now who identify as being neurodiverse who do not have a formal diagnosis and who self-identify. And that's something that particularly in the last 5 years has been a big changer, because a lot of people in the neurodiverse community, and again, I'm not signing my name to this to say I agree with it or not, but rather I'm wanting to give you the information, reject the medical model, reject the idea that medicalizing neurodiversity because they believe it to be unhelpful in some way, because it promotes the idea that there's something wrong with you. And many people who are neurodiverse don't see it that way. So on the cusp, neurodiversity is seen as being something about your brain working differently. So that's the neuro bit. So if you think about that from neuroscience, your brain or your neurology works differently. I feel limiting it to the brain is a bit limiting. So I like to say that I'm wired differently. Again, that's just my own personal way of identifying it, that the neurology that runs through my whole body, not just my brain, it is wired differently. And the diversity then is there to suggest difference. Again, somebody mentioned a while ago, is anyone really neurotypical? I don't know. I don't think anybody actually can answer that question. The way I look at this is that right now we know how much we know right now. And in 10 years, a lot of that is probably going to get blown out of the water. When I think about what we've learned about the brain in the last 2 decades, for example, the things we know now in 2024 that we didn't know in 2004 are quite startling. And I expect, because of what we will learn about the brain in the next 20 years, that that will change the whole understanding of neurodiversity again. So I prefer to kind of adopt as like, well, this is what we know right now, rather than again getting into this is or isn't what neurodiversity is. So Polly, do you want to take us on a little bit of a deeper dive on that?
Yeah, so this I'm hoping might answer some of the questions that came up in the groups as well. So I've borrowed this from an organization called the Do It. They are called Do It Profile. Or they're called Do It Solutions, but this tool they have is called a Do It Profiler, and people can go and do a kind of online screening to see what traits they have. So in the middle, we can see neurodiversity, and then it's just giving you some of the really typical traits that would come up for somebody who may be neurodiverse. So the less favorable traits that might come up are a real predisposition to depression, to fatigue, and to feeling anxious, to ruminate. That comes up a lot with people who are ADHD, a kind of sense of thinking of something and then it really like being able to stop those thoughts, and often the thoughts escalating into much, things getting quite feeling out of proportion as well and unmanageable. It's really small print, so I hope you're able to see this. Planning and working memory challenges. So a lot around working memory, particularly, that's a big trait for people with ADHD as well. Camouflage. So this is sometimes referred to as masking as well. So a sense of trying to sort of behave in a way that fits in for everybody else rather than in a way that feels authentic and true to yourself. And burnout is a big sort of issue for lots of people with neurodiversity. And then the positive traits that you would be aware of are having really high levels of empathy, being very creative, being persistent, being perfectionists, very imaginative, analytical, energetic, and problem solvers. Just to say, this is where it becomes really complicated. Not all neurodivergent people will display these traits. So I may be very imaginative and creative, and John may be very empathetic and persistent, but I may experience high levels of anxiety, whereas John may not. So just as an example, we can never say really all neurodivergent people are this or that. So what I love about this particular graphic is it does show the sort of the links between all the conditions. So the main ones are in the circle. So sort of the main conditions that could be diagnosed. So there's dyslexia. And if you look, I won't read through all of the different bits, but if you look around dyslexia, where we've got reading, spelling, reading comprehension, these are the things that are the most obvious traits that come up. Dyscalculia, this is very similar to dyslexia, but rather than being around reading, writing, it's more around numbers and and spatial awareness. There's developmental coordination disorder or dyspraxia, and which is more around sort of coordination and fine motor skills. And then attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, is fairly incorrectly named. I think there's a move to try and rename it, because it's not that there is a sort of an attention deficit necessarily. It's more about attention regulation. So people with ADHD may be able to focus, like hyper focus on something they're very interested in, but what's really difficult is focusing on something that they're not interested in. Not everybody with ADHD is hyperactive, and often hyperactivity isn't seen in a physical way, but it can be a sort of form of mental hyperactivity. So you get endless thoughts and ideas firing all the time in your brain. And tics and Tourette syndrome are often sort of coexist with ADHD, but again, not always. Autistic spectrum disorder, also called autistic spectrum condition, because there is a very strong argument that it isn't a disorder, it's just a difference. And developmental language disorder, so this is around speaking, listening, hearing, and so what I wish about this exam, and no doubt not example or diagram, and I imagine it will happen quite soon, is that it could be seen more as a globe, because John referred earlier to this idea of the spiky profile. So a spike, in my head, I imagine the spiky profile to be like a sort of globe that represents the person's brain, and there are these spikes that come out. So sorry, Julie. So the spikes will come out. So John, when you described your traits earlier, you said there's autism might have been higher, ADHD may have been somewhere, a bit of dyslexia that you had originally. So these are these spikes that would come out. And when I've done a profiling tool, I found that ADHD was very strong, but also I had dyslexia was a kind of another spike for me, dyscalculia, just so I have traits of those, not enough to get a diagnosis, but there are traits showing up. So I think this might answer the question a little bit around, does everybody have a neurodiverse brain? I'd say these are quite sort of typical of people who are neurodivergent. I think there's a whole other, this is probably not shared by the majority of the population to anything like the height of those spikes. Does that make sense? Yeah, John.
Yeah, well, it does to me.
So, and I think the other thing to point out, this is from 2021. I'm yet to find a better diagram, but it's 2024, and this I'm sure is out of date. And I can see there are things on here like color blindness, for example, isn't yet kind of seen as one of these within here, but both of my sons who are neurodivergent are both colorblind. I suspect there is a link there. It's just that we're too soon in the neuroscience to see if that is a factor as well.
Yeah, what I would probably add to that is that what I have managed to figure out about myself from piecing things together is that my spiky profile, if you like, or my flavor of neurodiversity is unique to me, like my DNA. And there's loads of different phenomenon on the screen here. And for me, it was about figuring out, ooh, which ones do I have? I don't have all of these, but I have some of them. And some of those are quite significant for me. And this is actually, from my perspective, which is a personal opinion, why the medical model and an assessment to diagnose is really unhelpful, because what the clinician will do when assessing to diagnose is they will do a differential diagnosis where they look at okay, you've been put forward for an autism diagnosis. Is there anything else that could better explain this? No. Do you meet the criteria as set out in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistic Manual? Yes. Okay, you're autistic. The problem with that is that it may negate the fact that people have characteristics of the other ones, and they might walk away not acknowledging or recognizing that, and they may think, oh, but I've got this autism diagnosis, so everything should be okay now because it's about managing that and learning about that. But actually, that's not necessarily helpful. So when somebody comes to work with me, I go, right, well, we know you meet the threshold for one of them, but actually, let's take some time to figure out what your unique DNA around neurodiversity really is and how you identify, because that feels like a more holistic way at somebody understanding themselves, and often can release a lot of this kind of feeling of being really seen by themselves, because they're like, oh, I have that bit. That bit actually is really prominent, but it's the only bit from that quadrant or that area that I have, but it's about recognizing it. So this spiky profile thing is really important, I think.
Yeah, and John, you just when you were just talking reminded me that I think it's over 60% of people who are autistic have also got ADHD. And so this huge crossover, I think that just kind of demonstrates exactly what you're saying there about they're really not exclusive. And the more that people understand about a neurodiverse brain, the more they're able to identify, oh, actually, that makes complete sense. Because yeah, I don't know, whichever dyscalculia, I've always found arithmetic really difficult, but I've got a diagnosis of ADHD.
Mm. Yeah, somebody's just mentioned as well, Polly, as you were saying, that there's additional things on here about aphantasia, and that absolutely belongs on here as well. Probably somewhere not too far away from synesthesia, from vision, that kind of general area, I'd imagine. I'm not an expert, so I don't know where they would place it on this map, but I would have thought it wouldn't be too far away from synesthesia.
Yeah, and aphantasia, for anybody who doesn't know, is an inability to imagine things, imagine pictures. The other thing I was thinking as well, there's a kind of there is a name for it, but I can't remember what it's called. But it's when people are really, really flexible. So very
Hypermobility.
yeah, but it's called Erin. There's a woman's name.
Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. So that then leads to issues with mobility, for example, as well. But again, that's not showing here. I don't know if that's because it hasn't yet been formally sort of included in what's considered to be a neurodivergent condition, or if it's just that this isn't quite up to date enough yet. So
I think it's what you said. Well, I think it's probably both. The reality is that the medical model's always 5 to 10 years behind what people are actually experiencing themselves.
yeah,
And there's huge things around Ehlers-Danlos syndrome where some medical professionals recognize it as a phenomenon, and others who don't, much like has happened with many other things,
yeah,
which ends up people feeling gaslit or misunderstood or not seen. So the neurodiverse community is quite strong on these things, but you'll often find that the services then aren't as strong because the medical model is behind and hasn't updated its thinking and or inclusion. But yeah, the co-occurring phenomenon are huge when you get
yeah,
into it.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, shall we move on from this?
Yes, let's do it. So we've talked a little bit about what neurodiversity is, and we're all here because we're interested in coaching. So let's talk a little bit about that context now in relation to neurodiversity. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about neurodiversity affirming practice, and then we're going to come back to the what not to do, which is a bit of a cautionary piece for people, because Polly and I think it's important. So when I first realized I was neurodiverse, I very much saw it as, oh, this is something that's wrong with me. I'm different from other people. It's a disability. And then in 2020, 20, I started to notice that people were talking about neuroaffirmative. And I was like, oh, what's that? You know, what's this? And it was this idea that instead of seeing neurodiversity as a problem or something that's wrong with an individual or a disability, that we could affirm people's neurodiverse identity in a way that identified their strengths, um, that promoted autonomy and was respectful, and presumed competence rather than incompetence. So this reframing of neurodiversity has been something that has been happening a lot since 2020. And again, with that, it's been spearheaded by neurodiverse people themselves. So what you've kind of seen happen in the last 5 years is that a lot of neurodiverse people have been standing up and saying, actually, this isn't okay. The status quo isn't going to float anymore. And services and policy now are being developed by neurodivergent people for neurodivergent people, where neurodivergent people can take ownership and give input into how it needs to be in order for it to work for them. And that's been a really empowering movement for a lot of neurodiverse people. And in the UK, you will see people like Kieran Rose, who refers to himself as the autistic advocate. He talks a lot about neurodiverse affirming practice, and he is a neurodiverse academic who researches and writes about neurodiversity and in particular autism. Luke Bearden, who's can't remember what university he works at, but again, he's a lecturer, professor at a university, runs a postgraduate qualification in autism. He talks a lot about neuroaffirming practice and researches in that area as well. And then also Amy Pearson. So these three people, particularly in the UK, are very strong on this area and have been rejecting some of the past thinking made by I'm going to use inverted commas neurotypical people, because I'm not quite convinced that they were neurotypical, but they could be. But it really has a bang, if you like, of what happened a lot in healthcare and in the past, where certain cohorts of people who were most likely men and most likely white made decisions about other cohorts of people without actually consulting them. So there's a whole socio-political aspect to this as well. And it's about really changing the narrative and saying, if you're going to make policy, if you're going to decide what this diagnostic criteria is, if you're going to provide services, you can't do that without the input from neurodivergent people. We need to have a seat at the table. We need to have a voice. We need to be involved. And we'd really rather that you saw us as people who were competent, had something to contribute, and honor our neurodivergent culture. So this neuroaffirming practice then has bled into healthcare and hospitals, primary care, psychotherapies, clinical psychology, many service provisions. And this is relevant for coaching as well. And in order for us to adopt a neuroaffirming stance in coaching, then we need to ask ourselves some questions. Like, for example, the question Polly and I asked you at the very beginning of the workshop, like, what perspectives are you arriving with? So if you've grown up in a world where there has been prejudice, it's most likely you've internalized some of that prejudice yourself. And in order for you as a coach to adopt a neuroaffirming practice, then you're going to need to take a look at any potential prejudice you might be carrying and examine it, you know, about what are your thoughts about capacity, for example, and people's competence. Do you hold ideas or beliefs about yourself or about others? Because if you're going to have a neuroaffirming practice and you're going to work with neurodivergent clients, that needs to be spoken about, even in right from the get-go, you know, looking at your website. Does your website have anything on it? What's the copy really saying to people? All of these things. So adopting a neuroaffirming practice is not about sticking a badge on your window saying, I work with neurodivergent people. That's a nice thing to do, and it shows a welcoming environment, but it's a bit more than that. It's about really taking the time to ask yourself, what ideas and beliefs do I hold about this? And am I open to changing them? Am I open to thinking differently? And am I open to not being an expert? Am I open to the fact that I might actually learn from my clients about what neurodiversity is like, rather than I going in being the expert? Am I willing to do that and let go of some of the conditioning that I might have received throughout my life around this topic? For me, a neuroaffirming practice runs deeper than just all being related to neurodiversity. It's part of a wider social movement of inclusivity. So this is then where the intersectionality aspect comes in. So looking at gender, sexuality, race, all of these topics then have to be bled into having a neuroaffirming practice, because many neurodiverse clients will be arriving with intersectional experiences, and only being neuroaffirming isn't going to work. Because the one thing I've learned about neurodiverse people is their ability to smell things and spot things that don't sit right with them is usually next to none. And people will be able to pick up on it, even if it's really subtle. This is often a key quality of neurodiverse people, actually. And the integrity of things becomes really important then. So looking beyond neurodiversity and looking to other issues becomes really important, particularly like I mentioned around gender identity. Huge cohort in that community identifying as neurodiverse, who identify as trans or another diverse gender identity. Polly, you wanted to talk about what not to do.
Yeah, so again, from the Do It profile of people, but I thought this is quite a nice kind of simple way of looking at what can be harmful versus helpful. So on the harmful side, the kind of things, coming up with banter can be seen as a microaggression, and talking over, so interrupting, really unhelpful. Things that are kind of making fun, that can be seen as funny by others, but not feeling funny for the person. And lots of these obviously are the same for anybody, whether they have a diagnosis or identify as being neurodivergent. But these are things that come up often. These are regularly occurring sort of microaggressions experienced by neurodivergent people. Having their opinions ignored, belittling assistance needs, not extending social invites, dismissive that someone has neurodivergent traits. This is something to really watch out for. I think I can't tell you how often people who've had a late diagnosis will come and say that they don't get validation from family and friends who say, "Oh, come on, we're all a bit like that." Can feel that's the kind of comment that people can find really hurtful when they've just got to the point of telling people that they have had this diagnosis, assuming that they're less competent. And then some positive things that you can do is being very sort of overtly friendly, using very friendly gestures, asking others for their opinions, listening, offering support, being an ally, giving credit, recognizing their achievements, and taking a really genuine professional interest in someone, and opening opportunities for them. So really being their advocate as well. And lots of this is sort of building on what John just said, but it's just a kind of a simple graphic for you, just to put that together for you. So I'll move on, John, because I'm conscious of time.
Yeah, me too. I won't spend very long on this, but this kind of just backs up what we've already been saying in the last two slides about, how to approach neurodiversity in coaching, and this idea as well of coaching someone who is neurodiverse versus coaching neurodiversity. So there's a couple of different slants, if you like, or lenses you could look on this from. First one is, are you coaching a person, or are you coaching some part of their identity? So for example, somebody might come to you and say that they need coaching because they are getting promoted and they want support transitioning into the new role. Okay. This person might happen to be neurodiverse, and as such, it might be about having an awareness. So being open, curious, adopting a neuroaffirming stance, and really, like Polly said, you know, asking them what they want or need from you in relation to their identity. And then, of course, having some ethical considerations, like, you know, really top of mind is do no harm. So threading carefully, um, asking yourself if you have the right competence or skill level to work with this person. Do you have supervision? And then if the work becomes unsuitable for coaching or for you, do you have referral options? Is there somebody else you can refer them to? And that might be a pretty straightforward path. You might like to do more reading. You might like to listen to podcasts, do an awareness course, whatever it might be. And then on the other side, there's working with people who are really wanting to work on their neurodiversity specifically. These people might be newly diagnosed or identified. They might be people who are self-identifying. They might be people who have been identified or diagnosed for a while, but are in some way needing support or wanting to work on something that is in direct relation to how they identify. That, in our view, most likely requires everything on the left and then these additional pieces on the right, which is specialist training in the identity they're identifying with, and specialist supervision, most likely provided by a supervisor who has a lot of experience in working in that specialism. Because again, this is where things are becoming more complex now. And again, Polly and I don't want to make up any rules. That's not what this is about. We're wanting to usher and signpost people in a direction that we feel best practices, rather than saying this is what you should or have to do. Saying we think this is what best practice would look like if that's what you were intending to do. Because there are complexities in working directly on somebody's neurodiversity with them that you need to be aware of and you need to thread carefully with, because the potential to do harm is real and it's a real person's life. So the intent might be good, and there's still a potential to do harm. So really taking that seriously is important from our perspective. Anything else you wanted to say on that, Polly, before we move on?
No, I agree with everything you said. I think also one of the comments at the beginning around the link with trauma as well. Most people who have specialist training in neurodiversity will also be aware that trauma can show up in a very similar way. So that sort of sensitivity, you'll have that in your training, that sensitivity to what is this that we're dealing with, in a way to ask questions around it that can be helpful as well. And I'd say as coaches, just contracting so strongly right at the beginning around neurodiversity. I think when it comes to people who are coming specifically to be coached around their neurodivergence, it's the knowledge is just so helpful, and that's where I start to worry about our bit ethically doing no harm. If we don't really understand this person's brain, who are with us, how, you know, I feel like, how could I do no harm, which is what led me to train to get specialist information in how to coach people, and reading more. There's so much information out there, joining communities of people who they were working with them. And I think the point about supervision is really, really key. I actually wrote my essay in my postgrad on coaching supervision about this very subject to try and get to the bottom of my view on it. And again, if you're going to a supervisor with an issue that one of your clients who's neurodivergent is facing, you know, as supervisors, we're able to give you information, up-to-date knowledge, you know, tips and things. So if your supervisor doesn't have that knowledge, that's quite limits you as a coach to grow in that space as well.
There's two other things I want to say before we move on. One is about lived experience versus specialist training. There's an argument with some people that, well, lived experience makes you have expertise because of what you've experienced. Polly and I don't buy this. It would be so easy for me to say, oh, well, I'm an expert because I identify with all of these, and that means that I can supervise people with all of these experiences, and there you go. We don't buy it. Again, we're not suggesting a rule or anything like that. We're just saying it's not our philosophy. Polly and I have both invested in doing training because the reality is my experience of being anything and my experience of working with somebody who has it are two completely different things. And just because I experience being autistic in a certain way does not mean that another person's going to experience in the same way. One of my favorite sayings is, when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. I'm constantly saying that, and with my clients, when I meet them, I'm constantly going, oh, that's how it is for you, because it's so totally different for me. The second thing around trauma, for people who are late diagnosed as adults, the reality is trauma probably will be there because it will have been traumatic to grow up in a world where you didn't know you were neurodiverse and masking heavily. So it's probably there anyway if people are like late diagnosed as an adult. And for people who were identified early in life as a child, although best intent to put supports in place for people, it doesn't mean that they've come away from school and other environments which are really not set up for neurodiverse people unscathed. So I'd say this is another reason to seek specialist training, because needing to thread the line between trauma and working in neurodiversity, from my perspective, is often a fine line, and navigating that can be complex, which is why supervision is so important. I often, when I'm coaching neurodiverse people, they're in therapy as well at the same time as seeing me for coaching. And they're having different needs met in those two different places. Not always, often. Okay, so we're going to invite you back into breakout rooms again. So this time it's, what does neurodiversity mean to you now, having heard what Polly and I had to share, and what are you taking away from this workshop for you? So we're going to pop you back into groups. It won't necessarily be the same groups, for 10 minutes.
I've hit the recording again, because we're going to move into a Q&A and wrap things up here. But if anybody does contribute and wants me to pause the recording, just let me know and I will do that.
Thanks, Jane. So I've just popped a link because somebody asked before you went into the breakout rooms about podcasts. That one straight away anyway from Kieran Rose, I definitely, but that's more autism specific. Although I would say that Kieran does a good job at talking about spiky profiles. So even if you did the Inside of Autism course, you're going to learn so much more about all of the other neurodiversities as well, because he speaks about all of them, even though it's a kind of an autism specific course. I think that course is the best value thing that anyone could do. You learn so much. It is a bit info dumpy because he just talks and talks and talks and talks and gives loads of information. But if you're hungry for information, then that will satisfy your need. So we have some time now, like Jane said, for Q&A. So you can ask questions in the chat. You can put your hand up. You can direct them at Polly. You can direct them at me. Whatever you'd like to do. Helen.
Our group just had a really interesting discussion about kind of the ethics of coaching, how to be a great coach when particularly with ADHD, when some of the kind of typical coaching tools, and I'm talking very much, the kind of standardized, opening things up, thinking big, visualizing, when these kind of things are really can be very difficult. And I've definitely had clients, and so have the others in our group, where that was just too much. It's too unboundaried, and yet that is sort of good coaching practice, let's say. So how to kind of create a container that feels safe and manageable for somebody who's identifying as with ADHD, whilst maintaining like great coaching practice.
Did you want one of us in particular to respond to that?
Polly, probably. I'm looking at you, Polly.
So I would say this is where I'd say you need to get more specialist, certainly supervision, and probably look into really how can you specialize and get a deeper understanding, because underpinning all of that, I would think, is the ethical thing. Is this really great coaching? Like, it's about holding your clients safe in a very safe space, I'd say. And if you're not able to meet their needs, whatever you do isn't going to be really great coaching if you're off the mark. So quite often coaches who haven't done any particular specialist training but are coaching an ADHD client, people with ADHD, generally speaking, love people and are often people pleasers. And so it's quite a difficult trap you can find yourself in as a coach, because there'll be love, I'm speaking, this is a kind of typical scenario, but you could be coaching somebody who you really love, who seems really enthusiastic, who goes away making lots of promises, and they come back and they haven't done it, and then you can feel really deflated and think, well, people come back all the time and say they're just not committed, they don't do their homework. But actually that's all part of the problem. It's like, are they procrastinating? Why aren't they motivated to do it? Are they just saying yes in the space because you've nodded and they're like, oh, she likes this, so I'll do it more. And I had that experience myself. All the years that I was coaching and being coached and not knowing I had ADHD, that was then really exacerbating this feeling of shame of, I've even told my coach I'll do it and I can't be asked to do it. And actually it wasn't, now I know that it wasn't that I couldn't be bothered to do it when I left. It was actually, I wasn't motivated at all, because had they said to me on a scale of 1 to 10, how motivated are you? I'd have probably said 1, but I just kind of nodded and gave them the answers they wanted to, not even, it wasn't conscious. I think that's the other thing as well. It isn't conscious, so you don't know you're doing it. I didn't know I was people pleasing as a client in that space back then.
And that's really helpful, actually, just thinking about it as a scale, that's putting it on a scale. That's a really helpful way of helping all clients, but actually in terms of motivation for an action, I'll definitely take that.
Yeah, and I think if you have a client who says they have a diagnosis, but they want to continue to work with you, then I think it's just recontracting really, really tightly around what you're able to offer. And actually, if you want coaching around your ADHD, I probably don't have the knowledge yet to support you, but I know people who do. But if it's general life things, let's have a go. And if you feel that I'm not meeting your needs, and let's have a conversation about that. And I think just being really open that you might not be the expert, but you can try, you can try and support them, because there is also that all the research that shows that working with the right person really, really helps people to open up and trust. But it does, if it's around the actual condition, then that's where it becomes a bit more complicated.
The other thing I would say is that the coaching community is also going to need to take a long, hard look at itself, because most of the tools and theories were developed by men who are white and neurotypical. And that's a problem, not just for neurodiverse people, but for women, for people of color, for people who identify in different ways. So this isn't just relevant for neurodiversity. This is the whole coaching community. It's going to have to get with the program, because we're going to have to develop and think outside the box and say, well, this doesn't work for this whole cohort of people. So I think that's a big thing around tools, is that maybe actually we should just empty out the toolbox and start from scratch and say, if we were to put together a diverse, equitable, inclusive and accessible toolbox in the coaching community, what would that look like? That might be a good starting point, which I really doesn't answer your question necessarily, but I do think it's a bigger problem, if that makes sense. Yeah, which is the same in psychotherapy, because a lot of it was developed from there. Kat.
Hello.
Apologies for dodgy lighting. I'm sitting in my car. That was tremendously helpful, firstly. So thank you. My question is about us as a coach. If we kind of identify as neurodiverse, or like, you know, we experience some of those things. I think I've noticed when we were doing our coaching training, my ADHD tendency, like, you know, the ADHD really, I felt like it kind of interfered with my coaching. So and as I've kind of gone forwards, things like sustaining concentration when something's not interesting, if someone's speaking and you kind of notice your attention wavering or losing your train of thought in terms of, you know, the original goals that was discussed, and or kind of not scheduling in time to reflect or to prepare for a session, timekeeping, and actually that's kind of felt like it's got in the way of me progressing in my coaching. So I was just wondering if I know you probably can't share tips and techniques right now, it's probably not the right space for it, but is there anything that you would recommend for us as coaches who are neurodiverse to support us with developing a practice and to be able to serve our clients more without those things kind of getting in the way?
I mean, that's definitely a different lens for sure from what we're talking about here, because that's talking about you as a neurodiverse coach rather than
Yep,
coaching neurodiversity.
got you.
I would say, you know, supervision, go
Yeah,
for coaching yourself. Part of that journey is figuring out what works for you. And also it's pointless me and Polly in a way kind of giving ideas, because what
yeah,
works for us will not necessarily work for you. So I think it's more about having a space in which you can go to explore that and make sense of it.
yeah,
That takes time. Yeah, that's not something that happens overnight. But all of the things you were listing there sound familiar.
yeah,
So, yeah, you know, I also sharing that because I don't want you to feel like you're on your own. Yeah, that's
yeah,
very common.
I'd say they also do feel very like things you could take to supervision, but
yeah,
with a supervisor who understands what is
Exactly.
happening in your
Yeah,
brain.
this is the other
yeah,
thing, that if you're a neurodiverse coach, and again, I don't want to suggest lived experience equates understanding, but like I would get yourself a neurodiverse supervisor who does have an understanding, because the lived experience they will have will help you because they've slightly been through it in some way,
cool,
shape, or form. Yeah.
perfect, thank you.
Thanks, Cash.
John,
Yeah.
I've just seen the time and we promised we'd end on time, but Tom has his hand up.
Yes, we
What
did.
do we do?
I don't know. I don't know what we should do.
Tom, do you want to, shall we?
I can be really, really quick.
Oh, okay.
So we talked about tools that don't work with neurodiverse clients, typically, pardon the pun, visualization or challenging questions. Have you a very brief example of tools that do work in the typical scenario?
I mean, that's a really big question. And I don't want to dodge it, but I am not going to answer it now, because it's so hard to say, because if you go back to the point that Polly and I were making earlier about the spiky profile, then really actually my starting point with any new client is figuring out what their unique flavor of neurodiversity is. And then once we've figured out what their unique flavor is, and then I can think about what would and wouldn't work. So as they're telling me this works for me, this doesn't work for me, then I'm thinking, well, that tool's out, or this tool's out, or that tool's in. So it's actually a process of not what does and doesn't work with neurodiverse people, but what may or may not work with this person that's sitting in front of you. And that needs to be a co-creative process. So I'm very open with people and say, how do you feel about visualization? How do you feel about this? And then I'm noting down and saying, well, I won't do this, or I won't do that going forward, or I will try this. And it's a process of trial and error and process of elimination.
Okay, thanks for now.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, so over to you, Jane, to bring us to an end.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Polly, as well. Like, this just been a phenomenal session. I've felt that it would be really valuable to have a session like this as part of this community. So I'm really grateful to you both for giving up your time to come in and do that. Especially, you know, everything that we do in these groups is on a voluntary basis. So really genuine, heartfelt thanks from me, and I'm sure I echo that around the room from everybody that's been here today. And quite a few questions around, you know, what sort of trainings might be recommended. I think as well, there's so many interests in the room in terms of whether it's for your own personal application, your own curiosity for yourself, whether it's about helping in a coaching sense, which is obviously the main purpose of this training today. And John will be running a programme later in 2025 from March to October that's specifically tailored for coaches. So taking all of the training and experience that he has on multiple courses that are not coach specific, because there aren't hardly any, if any, coach specific trainings around, hence the programme being created. And taking that with the lens of a supervisor and a mentor and an assessor and a trainer, and blending the two so that there's a really robust paced programme that gives you the opportunity to really understand, integrate the learning, reflect on your practice, and share in the space with other people and their learnings too. So if you'd like more information on that, there's a link where you can get your ICF CCEUs for this session, and there's a box you can check if you'd like to hear more about other offerings. If you check that one, then we'll make sure we keep you updated with more details on that programme. But thank you all for being here and for being so engaged, and for all of your contributions and questions and everything else, and your warmth and connection in the space, which has made tonight really come to life. So really great for you all being here. Those of you in the Bristol Bath neck of the woods in the UK, if you'd like to meet in person, we have that in December, second Monday of December from 7 till 9, very close to Bath train station. We have a venue we use frequently, but I'm still trying to find something just with a little bit more specialness for that particular event. So keep your eye on the LinkedIn group page if you're keen to come to that. If you're further afield, we look forward to seeing you hopefully in January for our MCC demo with Lilith Flanagan. So I look forward to seeing you all again soon at some stage. Take care, go well, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye.